We'll continue with central nervous system. Okay, so the cerebral cortex, the gray matter on the outside of the cerebral hemispheres, we've talked about what each area does. Now, there's two cerebral hemispheres. There's a left and right. And although they somewhat mirror each other, with the left taking care of the right side of the body and the right hemisphere taking care of the left side of the body, there is also specialization, where there's a division of labor between the hemispheres. So there's this idea of lateralization. So not everybody is the same, but most people follow the same sort of patterns. For instance, language is in Broca's area in the left hemisphere in most people. And that's not just like left-handed people aren't that. It's just most people have that side dominant for that thing. So really, the left hemisphere in most people controls language, math, logic, that kind of stuff. Kind of rational intellect. Where the right hemisphere is where we have spatial skills, intuition, artistic skills, insight. This is where intuitive leaps happen, that kind of thing. But don't be mistaken into thinking that we can, be Mr. Spock and only use the left hemisphere. There's huge amount of interaction between the two hemispheres, where when you're listening to somebody speak, there is the left hemisphere kind of analysis of what's being said, but there's a right hemisphere intuition and context and body language and interpretation. It's the way that we can use sarcasm. It's the reason that we can tell when somebody's lying. We can tell when somebody's joking around. Because it's not just what's said. People that have brain damage on the right side really have trouble communicating, even though they understand language perfectly. They can't put it in context. They can't figure it out. There's no intuition there. So the two sides of the hemisphere have to communicate with each other. And so this is the job of the white matter. So the white matter is the myelinated part of the brain. And it connects one part of the cortex to another part of the cortex, or one part of the cortex to the lower brain, or to the spinal cord, down, that kind of thing. And there's basically three types of tracks, groups of nerves, of axons, really, that are myelinated and run together. And they kind of are grouped almost kind of like a cable running from one area to another. And the three types are called commissures. So the commissurial tracks connect left to right and right to left. And they all pass through an area of the brain called the corpus callosum. So this is where the intuitive part of what you're getting and the logical part of what you're getting come together. So it depends on the commissures. And a lot of studies are looking at people that have problems with those commissures, maybe surgically disconnected and that kind of thing. Um, there is another type of fiber which are called association fibers, and so they run kind of back to front, and they connect different parts of the cortex in the same hemisphere. So that would be the ones that go from like the primary visual to the visual association areas, those sorts of things. So these would be the association fibers. But it's all well and good that the brain functions. It's got to react with the periphery. And so the projection fibers are the white fibers that go down to the lower brain or into the spinal cord, or come up from the spinal cord up into the brain, into the cerebral hemispheres. So basically we need all three types to make these associations, to communicate and to compile enough information. So the common serial fibers are these green ones. The association fibers are the red ones, and the projection fibers are these purple ones. Now, this part's the diencephalon, so these would be projection fibers going from the cortex down to the diencephalon, to the thalamus here. There is a theory that says that women tend to have more of these fibers than men do. Men's brains tend to be a lot more compartmentalized, and women's brains are much better at making associations. How true that is, I can't comment on, but there is a lot of evidence that says that. Now, with that said, these are averages. That doesn't mean that there are some men that exceed the mean of women, and there aren't some women that are at the mean of men. It's just that the two means are slightly different. So after these fibers, there are groups of cells that are found deep in the cerebral hemispheres, and they're called the basal nuclei because they're at the base. So they're not part of the cortex. They're much deeper. So one's called the caudate nucleus, which means the tail. The other is lentiform, which means it looks like a bean, like a lentil. And they are associated with subthalamic nuclei, and so they're associated with nuclei in the diencephalon and in the midbrain, and they tend to be more involved in baser functions rather than conscious function. So they're found deep down, kind of surrounding the thalamus. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these things, but you can see where they're found here. In the dissection, they're a different color. So they think that it influences muscular control, primarily in the starting and stopping of things. They get the muscle to start contracting, and then they stop the contraction. It seems that that's where it goes. Regulate attention and cognition. They inhibit unnecessary movement. So there is a real thought that Parkinson's disease is involved with these. So those tremors, Parkinsonian tremors, are something to do with the basal nuclei. People with Parkinson's have trouble starting and stopping movement. So now the next part of the brain is the diencephalon. And really, it's all the area around the third ventricle. The thalamus are the walls, the hypothalamus is the floor, and the epithalamus is the roof of the third ventricle. So the thalamus is most of it. It's the superior and lateral walls. There's all kinds of nuclei, and they're all named for their location. They have fibers coming from the cerebral cortex, and they also project up to the cerebral cortex. Really, the thalamus is almost like an old-fashioned telephone operator. Or it's almost like a family doctor, in that the family doctor's primary job is to take incoming information and direct the patient to the correct treatment or specialist. So you come in to your family doctor, you have a collection of symptoms, and then he determines, oh, you really need to see a physiotherapist, or we should send you to an ear, nose and throat guy, or we need to send you to an ophthalmologist or whatever. So they're kind of the gatekeeper of information. They communicate both ways. Well, that's what the thalamus does. It basically takes information in, processes it, and makes sure that it goes to the right part of the brain. And it takes information from the various parts of the brain and makes sure that it gets to the right part of the soma, the right part of the body. So it really edits information, relays information. So it mediates sensation. It's, again, involved with memory and that kind of thing. The hypothalamus is the floor of the ventricle. And there's a lot of nuclei that are involved with smell and with a few other things. But the most important part is something called the infundibulum. And that's the part that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. It really is the connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is the master endocrine organ. It's the one that directs all other endocrine organs. And the hypothalamus is kind of the base of the brain, and its job is to communicate with the endocrine system, primarily. And there's also some neurological stuff that it does. So it's really involved with control of a lot of the autonomic nervous system. So blood pressure, heartbeat, digestive tract motility, sweating, that kind of thing. But it's also the center for emotional response. This is where we have pleasure or fear. It all is mediated through the hypothalamus. And that's why those emotions really trigger endocrine responses as well as neurological responses. The hypothalamus is what regulates thirst, hunger, that kind of thing. And when we get to endocrine, we'll see that it also produces some some posterior pituitary hormones, which are really like neurotransmitters without a synapse. They just are released out into the body. The epithalamus is really the back of the roof of the third ventricle. And the major thing that we see here is it hangs like a pine cone from the top. It's called the pineal gland. And its job is to secrete melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that regulates your sleeping cycles, your sleep-wake cycles. Oftentimes this is called the third eye. It's because it seems to respond to light, but it's light hitting your retinas. There are some neurological connections to this part, and so when it gets dark, you release more melatonin and makes you sleepy. So it's all part of the circadian rhythm here. A lot of people take artificial melatonin in order to go to sleep because they try and boost it. So when we look at the diencephalon, it's here. So the thalamus, there's the pituitary gland hanging down here. So the hypothalamus is all of this area here. Right? The pineal gland is here, so it's part of the epithalamus. The brainstem. Now, the brainstem is the most primitive part of the brain. We see it in many lower animals, and there's three regions to it. There's the midbrain, which is exactly where you'd think it would be. And then there's a bunch of fibers that go left to right. There's tissue that connects left to right, and that's called the pons. And pons is Latin for bridge. It actually literally forms a bridge in the brainstem. And then there's a middle part that gets long, so it's the medulla oblongata. This is the transition to the spinal cord. So it looks like the spinal cord, but there's a lot more nuclei, groups of cells. And it's the primitive part of the brain. So this is where automatic behaviors happen. So this is heart rate and breathing, and a lot of that stuff happen. When we get to those systems, we'll talk about like respiratory centers and cardioacceleratory centers and things like that are all found in the medulla or in the pons. There are tracks, projection tracks, that connect down into the spinal cord or go up into the cerebral hemispheres. Most of the cranial nerves that we're going to be talking about in class are connected here. 10 of the 12 of them, actually. So it's all in this area, and you'll notice that that's the pons. It looks like a bridge across. This is the medulla oblongata here. The midbrain is up here behind the pons, kind of below the diencephalon. These two little things are called the mammillary body because they kind of look like breasts, like mammalia. So here's kind of the midbrain, medulla, and pons all separate with the various cranial nerves that we will talk about, like I say, later. Again, please don't memorize all of this stuff. But you can see that the thalamus, which is the diencephalon, is here. The pituitary is here. And these fibers end up, as the midbrain ends up kind of connecting right up into there. So the midbrain has the cerebral aqueduct, which is the channel between the third and the fourth ventricle, and there are motor tracks here. This is where information from the motor cortex of the cerebrum ends up getting down into the correct parts of the body. So they pass through here on their way to the periphery. There are various nuclei there. So this is where the motor for your eyeballs all happens. Ocular motor, trochlear, probably abducens as well. There's linkages here to the basal nuclei. A lot of reflexes happen here. So visual reflexes and auditory relay centers all happen down here. The substantia nigra means the black substance, and it's linked to the basal nuclei, and it seems to be involved with Parkinson's, with that kind of thing. And I'm sure that you've talked in psychology about dopamine and such. That's here. The red nuclei is relays for motor pathways, and it's part of the arousal system. So there you go. The pons, it's the anterior wall. It connects higher brain centers to the spinal cord. It's involved with relaying impulses from the motor cortex to the cerebellum, and we'll get into what that does in just a couple of minutes. But it's very much involved as a relay center, because it's very important that the motor cortex not only tells the muscles what to do, but it tells the cerebellum what it intends the muscles to do. Some of the respiratory centers are found in the pons as well. So it ends up looking like this. The medulla oblongata is kind of the part that joins onto the spinal cord. So if it's in the skull, it's medulla oblongata. If it's out of the skull, it's the spinal cord. There's a real transition here. There's part of the fourth ventricle is in here. This is where the corticospinal tracts cross over. So this is why the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. It all crosses over here at the medulla oblongata. There's sensory information, for somatosensory information gets relayed from here. Various cranial nerves. This mediates things like balance, so it coordinates the responses to changes in the vestibular. So it's involved with a coordination between various sensations and automatically. So things like balance and posture. A lot of your autonomic reflex centers are here. So Cardioacceleratory centers. This is where control of vasodilation and vasoconstriction happen. So it regulates blood pressure, things like that. As I said, the respiratory centers are here. This is also where you hiccup and you swallow and you sneeze and you vomit. It controls all of those kind of reflex sort of things. This choroid plexus here is involved with the making and reabsorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. So the last part of the brain to be discussed is the cerebellum. It's found dorsally. It looks kind of like a cauliflower, and it's involved with making patterns in skeletal muscle contraction. It's involved with fine-tuning and timing of things so that you don't overshoot or undershoot it. So it doesn't initiate these things, it just fine-tunes them. And it does it in a subconscious way. We don't have to actually think about it. There's I had a patient who actually had cerebellar damage from a stroke, but the stroke was not in her cerebrum, it was in her cerebellum. And everybody thought she was drunk all the time because she had no precision in her movements, and she had no her skeletal muscle patterns were inappropriate. She had trouble maintaining balance and that kind of thing. She really came across like she was loaded all the time. She had trouble enunciating words and that kind of thing. And the really sad part about it is that she was a scrub nurse for a famous neurosurgeon at Sunnybrook. And she was a very accomplished, very intelligent woman, but she hardly went out in public because everybody thought she was pissed all the time. They thought that she was drunk. And so it actually taught me a lot about what the cerebellum does. So there's two hemispheres of it, and it's connected by a vermis, which means worm. There's some lobes. There are gyri, and there is a pattern of gray matter and white matter. The white matter is called the arbor vitae, which means the tree of life, and the gyri, which is gray matter, are called folia, which means leaves. So they're the leaves on the tree of life. So when you look at it, it looks like this. These are all the folia, and this, the white matter, is the arbor vitae. I'm not going to worry about the lobes and the vermis here, but know this patterning. When you look at it in cross section, this is really the homunculus here. So you see how much it coordinates hands and feet, less so in the trunk. Facial expression, head is all controlled here. So it says that all fibers are ipsilateral, so they work on the same side. Don't worry about the peduncles at all. So here's what this cerebellum does for us mostly. What it does is it receives impulses from the cerebral cortex on the intent to use voluntary muscle. And it takes the intent and it compares it to information that comes from the proprioceptors, the equilibrium, so the from your ears and your eyes, and it informs the cerebellum of the position. And then what it does, it compares what the cerebrum intends to happen and what the proprioceptors say is happening, and it makes corrections. So it makes the smooth coordination of muscle contraction. And it feeds back to the cerebral motor cortex. It doesn't, and goes down to the brainstem to a certain extent, but it doesn't tell the muscles what to do. It tells the brain, it tells the cerebrum the best way to correct what's happening so that it matches the intent. There's a little bit of cognitive function here. It's about predicting sequences of events in complex movements. We use this sort of thing, for instance, Troy Tulowitzki uses it a lot as a shortstop. He can predict the sequence of events and have the complex movements match it so that in a very brief amount of time he can be in the position to catch a ball in a certain way and then throw the ball to first base. Like that's a very, very complex bunch of things going on, and the cerebellum deals with it. He doesn't have to think about it. It just happens there. This is something that's coming more and more to light, that word association and problem solving starts to seem that the cerebellum is involved in that.